Nice of all of you to join us. And Glenn, I want to start with you. It's never easy, I know, for a family to discuss what's happened in your family in very tragic circumstances. What can you share with us, though, about that crime? What took place?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, Stan. In the middle of September last year, my father-in-law, Craig Smith, was murdered on his farm, his sugarcane farm, which is about 60 kilometres outside like a regional town of Pietermaritzburg in the state of KwaZulu-Natal. As far as it's a crime that still hasn't been solved, but he was tied up. He was beaten to death with a walking stick. There was some theft, only of a couple of firearms that were stored in his safe and some jewellery. The perpetrators, we know there were at least two of them because they did sit down and have a drink in his lounge room afterwards. The cans of drink have been recovered, and that's sort of part of the ongoing investigation.
Now, Glenn, you say it hasn't been solved. Are they looking at this as a hate crime, if you like? Is there a racial motive that can be linked to the murder?
I wouldn't say there can be a racial motive linked. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was racially motivated, but these things are, I mean, as I've written in an article I covered on this, but it was the incident sends shockwaves through the whole community, through the farming community there, and the more farm murders like this that happen, the more farmers are just going to leave. And whether is that a concerted campaign? I mean, you can't say it's a concerted campaign to get farmers to leave, but the results could be the same. If farmers leave, who do the farms then go to? We're hearing, and the problem that I see is this talk of the government legitimising this, potentially legitimising moves like this, and we hear more talk of expropriation without compensation. And I was just prompted to just wanted to get the story told for Craig, and for in the context of what we're seeing, it's becoming an issue that the humanitarian aspect of it is being lost, and it shouldn't be a political issue. It really shouldn't.
Sisonke, when you hear that story, just a tragic story to happen to any family, and we know just how difficult it is to even be able to determine what a motivation is, the numbers of people killed, because a lot of those statistics are not necessarily kept, are they?
Yes, just to say firstly, Glenn, that I'm very sorry for your loss. That's a terrible story, and one that unfortunately is far too familiar to me personally, and in terms of my own family and friends. I think that unfortunately it's a story that's all too common amongst many South Africans of a broad range of all colours. I think there's one thing that South Africans across race, the colour line, can agree on, and that's crime is a very big problem, and that unfortunately it's often motivated by the deep inequalities that we continue to see in our country. So Glenn and I are lucky in a sense that we are able to talk about the tragedies that have happened to our lives. We're not lucky that they happened, but we're certainly lucky that we can talk about them because we have access to the media. I think for many farm laborers, for many poor Black South Africans who continue to make up a big part of that 19,000 murders that we heard about in the setup, that isn't the case. So I think the real conversation really needs to be, and as Glenn pointed out rightly, that this isn't a political issue. And unfortunately, we have Minister Dutton politicizing it in the worst, most divisive, most hateful kind of way.
I want to come to that a little bit later, but I just want to, when you talk about not being a political issue, but it is, Sisonke, isn't it? It is front and centre a political issue in South Africa. You hear Julius Malema talking about confiscating the land without compensation, the Parliament passing that motion, Cyril Ramaphosa now using the same language. It is a political issue, isn't it?
It certainly is a political issue, but I would break down the way that you characterize it slightly. I think there's a very big difference between Julius Malema, who is the head of an opposition party that at the last elections only was able to gain 6% of the national vote. So he represents a very small minority party, loud voice, no question, but I think it's very important to be guided by numbers here. So the EFF is a growing party, no doubt. It seeks to talk about very deep issues, and it uses a lot of populism in its rhetoric, but it only represents a small party of less than 6% of the electorate. So that's the first one. I think to use a small clip by our new president and to characterize that as an endorsement of the whole idea of expropriation in an arbitrary manner, I think is not a fair thing to do. And I actually find it interesting and rather absurd that for the first time in 10 years, South Africans have such a good news story, which is a new president who has been installed on the basis of civil society action and the activism and the institutions of democracy winning. And we're talking about, a conversation that Peter Dutton is inspiring us to have.
I do want to pursue that as well, Sisonke, but I do want to drill down, Ben Cousins, on this idea. As Sisonke pointed out there, if Julius Malema, who was a former ANC renegade, now this economic freedom fighters, if he does represent, as Sisonke says, a small percentage, why is he having this seemingly outsized effect? And you have the Parliament passing a motion to reclaim that land?
Well, over the last 8 or 9 years under President Zuma, the South African population has become disenchanted with the ANC. Last election results showed still massive support, but increasingly people are unhappy about the performance of the ANC. And this includes rural people who are still insecure on their land, or who have land restitution claims which have not been processed, or who are wanting land to be redistributed to them and are not receiving it. And in urban areas, we have very large populations of informal settlements with, again, insecure tenure and little prospect of getting a job in the formal economy. So at the ground of society, in the grassroots of society, there's a lot of unhappiness about, firstly, the overall socioeconomic situation. We must remember we've got 37% unemployment, and youth between the age of 18 and 35 between 50 and 60% unemployment, and one of the highest rates of inequality in the world. There's a lot of unhappiness about society in South Africa. And the politicians in the ANC are worried about it. The EFF has taken a sensitive issue, the land question, something one cannot ignore, something that has to be addressed. And they're making it an electoral issue. Well, the ANC is very sensitive to that.
Ben, could I just come in on that and just drill down a little bit on this land reform, land reclaiming issue? You do have a minority, fewer than 10%, holding a majority of land, over 60% of land. But how do you redistribute that in a way that is fair and just without the language that we're using now, which is to expropriate the land without compensation?
I think we have to take a close look at the South African Constitution, and in particular the Bill of Rights and Section 25 on property. The Constitution as a whole is a mandate for social transformation. And Section 25 on property is likewise a mandate for transformation. The Constitution enables land reform, land restitution, tenure reform, and access to natural resources. It calls for promoting equitable access in land. It does provide that compensation is to be paid where land is expropriated, but it provides criteria for just and equitable compensation. And I personally don't think the Constitution is going to be altered. I think the existing provisions of Section 25 will be retained. But I do think that just and equitable compensation in some cases can involve little or no compensation. And I can explain why that is. So I actually think this is a very useful debate. It has its dangers, particularly in the panicked reaction of white farmers and others. But mostly it's a positive development because at last South African society is talking seriously about the land question after neglecting it for 24 years.
Sisonke, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I just want to ask you, Glenn, do you draw a connection between the politics of land reform and the violence that we have seen and your father-in-law's death? Is that a clear connection that you are able to establish?
I guess the short answer to that is no, not necessarily. Yeah, but there are other aspects to this that I kind of wanted to touch on
Yes.
as well. I mean, in terms of in a domestic sense, for us here in Australia, the way it's been characterised by the press to an extent, but also by people who are reading these and commenting, because we are in a two-way sort of communication environment these days. And this view that it's a binary issue that you can't be... I'm equally disgusted by what's happening on Manus Island and on Nauru, and for those refugees and the resettlement process and whatnot, by this. And a lot of people have been commenting, not all, not even a majority, but people have been saying that these farmers should join the queue like everyone else. And absolutely fine. But I mean, I know how long it takes for people to actually get through legal means into this country. Even my wife, she was married to an Australian, took 2.5 years. A farmer who's leaving South Africa with their whole family, if they can't even sell their farm before they leave, which is another issue, comes here. We had the luxury of my family being here, and we could live on one income because we were able to arrange things such. But how is a family that comes out here, 2 kids, mother, father, relying on one income? They bring with them South African rand, which are worth, it's I think 11 to 1 is the currency is worth very little, and it will be worth even less if, despite the bounce we saw when Ramaphosa was first installed. Now I suspect it'll probably trend down again.
Sisonke, when you hear that and you look at the plight, if we even ignore the issue of race, and I know how heated this can become, but if you have, as Glenn has outlined, people who may have to leave their properties, if there is, and we know there is violence, we can argue the extent of it and the political implications of that. Isn't there a case that people need to find safe haven and refuge, and that Australia presents itself as an option?
No, I don't. And I think it's a bit of a fantasy to propose that we can somehow leave race aside. If Australians are genuinely concerned with the plight of people who are in dire circumstances in South Africa, there's the scourge of murders of lesbians that has been taking place, that has been well documented as human rights abuse of gender non-conforming people. There's the situation of farm laborers, which has been well documented. So all of those people would also then need to qualify, and then also need to be provided with visas on a similarly urgent basis. I think that Ben has laid out very eloquently the whole way in which there is a broad conversation that South Africans are engaged in across the colour line about issues that we delayed for many years under Mandela at first, and certainly in the last 10 years, because we've been preoccupied with a whole different set of problems. And I think that what has been called for at the moment is a public consultation process, a big national conversation that is long overdue, that will not be easy, but certainly will not be helped by politicking from people very far away who don't understand the complexities and the difficulties we're grappling with.
But Australia does have a non-discriminatory immigration policy, a non-discriminatory humanitarian policy, and again reflecting on the plight of people here who maybe have to leave their homes and their farms and look for a place to bring their family. Isn't it reasonable that a case can be made for people to come here on the basis of a non-discriminatory policy? That's not a racist act.
Sure, I think it would be reasonable if we weren't sitting with an Australia that has the twin crises of racial injustice against Aboriginal people, and of course the $10 billion problem that has been created that has left a refugee situation in Manus Island and in Nauru. So if those weren't hanging over the heads of Australians, and in fact Mr. Dutton in particular, I think it would be an easier conversation to have. But it kind of beggars belief that we are having this conversation about a relatively privileged group of people far away who, of course, are undergoing some serious issues alongside their black compatriots, when in fact we have Manus Island and Nauru, which are really serious questions for this country.
Ben, I want to come to you on this question about how this is being perceived. We've heard from Julius Malema and his comments about, we'll just leave and go to Australia. I want to see how this is being perceived in South Africa and the comments that have been made in Australia, how this is being seen.
I think...
sorry, if I could go to Ben. Sorry, Sisonke.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, well, there was a strong response from the new Minister of International Relations, I think appropriately so. Some South Africans would see this as sledging by an Australian minister. I actually think that very few South Africans are thinking about, well, it's time to go. I think young people, young whites, sometimes are emigrating, but the majority of white South Africans feel safe and secure. Actually, if we think about the rate of murder and violent crime, it's the black population which suffers most. What's quite remarkable about post-apartheid South Africa, given the vast inequalities that exist, is how little violent crime whites actually experience. So actually, if we think about white farmers, there were about 60,000 white farmers in 1994. There are now about 30,000, according to official statistics. The majority of those, the 30,000 farmers who got out of farming, have sold up and got involved in the urban economy, and most of them are doing pretty well. I don't think this is a situation of an oppressed racial minority having to flee the country. That's a gross mischaracterization of the situation at the present. What we really need is white farmers to come to the party, to come forward with constructive solutions. Some of them have been doing so, actually, and some of them are even willing to donate portions of land for land reform purposes. I think this national conversation, which Sisonke talks about, is an urgent thing, and I think it's going to start happening. And I think we have to have a little bit of trust in the new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, that he's willing to listen to ordinary South Africans. And I think white and black, we all need to come into that space and start talking seriously to one another.
And just such a difficult conversation to have. I'm glad that you've been able to join us all this evening. Sisonke, thanks to you. Ben, thank you for joining us. And our commiserations and sympathies to your family as well, Glenn. Thank you for being part of this conversation as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.